first. If you want to know why this government, any government, why governing is so hard in this country, the Senate is not a bad place to start. The defeat of the Union Governance Bill and the stalling of changes to Labor's Medivac laws has once more highlighted the problem of the Senate and how hard it is for any centre-right government to make its policies happen if those policies require getting legislation through our federal parliament's upper house. People often forget that while the government is formed by a majority in the House of Representatives, to get any legislation through the parliament, it needs a majority in the Senate as well. Only once since the Senate was expanded in 1984 has the government of the day had a majority in its own right in the upper house. That was back in 2004, after the coalition fluked a 4-seat Senate win out of a possible 6 in Queensland. Apart from those 3 years out of the last 35 years, the government of the day, Labor and Liberal, both of them have had to cobble together a Senate majority, bill after bill, issue after issue. Now, the reality is that this hasn't been too hard for the Labor Party to do. Governments of the centre-left can readily find people on the crossbench who support more spending, more regulating and more taxes on the so-called rich. Indeed, for Labor, with only a couple of exceptions, the Greens are a locked and loaded vote, operating more or less in an alliance with Labor. But governments of the centre-right can count on no such crossbench support if they want to regulate less, spend less, or cut taxes to let all of us and ordinary workers keep more of our money. The 2014 budget, the last budget that sought to bring in serious structural reform, is a perfect example of Senate sabotage. And last night we had another one, with the defeat of the government's union-busting bill that, despite May's election mandate, saw a motley crew of senators decide they didn't give a toss about what the people might have voted for. Sadly, this is why the current government often seems to be in office but not in power, because getting anything through the Senate, once Labor has pledged not to support it, requires hoovering up cross-bench votes, and invariably there's a price to be paid to appease the Pauline Hansons, the Jackie Lambies and the Centre Alliance types without whom the government can't get a single law passed. Poor Matthias Cormann, the government's Senate leader and chief negotiator, he must often think he's wrestling with a column of smoke. And last night's defeat was worse than most. It was worse because the government had acted in good faith with Senator Hanson and had accepted a whole series of changes or amendments that she wanted made. The government went ahead and made them, but still Hanson reneged and she voted with Labor to reject the legislation. Pauline wasn't the only capricious one though. Jackie Lambie said she would vote for this union-busting bill if John Setka refused to resign. Well, Setka's still there, but Lambie voted against the legislation anyway. She says she's prepared to vote to repeal Labor's Medivac laws with just one amendment, but who knows what that amendment is, she's not telling. Now, it's dead wrong that a government can be elected with a clear mandate and then find that mandate ignored and its legislative agenda rejected or emasculated in a Senate dominated by quirky independents or minor parties like the Greens, with a tiny percentage of the vote. Is it any wonder more and more voters are turned off politics in this country? Now, as you know, I have some time for Pauline Hanson, but should it really be up to the likes of her and her somewhat eccentric team to hold back the government from getting done what it was elected to do? Sadly, that's the reality of the Senate, that no centre-right government can ever count on any sort of workable majority. And don't even get me started on COAG. That's the place where sensible decision-making and good policy goes to die, thanks to the dog's breakfast of divided responsibilities between the Commonwealth and the states. Now, in the old days, when each state had 10 senators and 5 were up for election each time, a quota was just over 16% of the vote, which meant roughly, in broad terms, 48% of the overall vote. Now, that was something a party could do, and it could get a majority of senators up for grabs in any one state. But since 1984, as I said, and the expansion of the parliament, with 6 senators now up for grabs at a normal half-Senate election, a party has to get roughly 56% of the vote to score 4 senators or a majority in any state. And that's so hard that it's hardly ever happened. As I said, only in 2004. That's the only time since 1984. Now, there is a way forward, but it won't be popular because at first glance, no one wants more MPs. But if the parliament were again expanded so that there were 7 Senate seats, not 6, Senate 7 seats, up for grabs at each half-Senate election, you could win 4 out of 7, a majority in any state, with just 50% of the vote. Now that's hard, but it's not impossible. And it would give the government of the day a reasonable chance of actually being able to pass the bills through that it took to the election it won. Or it could at least have a good shot at it. Forget the confected controversy over Angus Taylor and Scott Morrison's call to his former neighbour, the New South Wales Police Commissioner. The real problem this week is the government's inability to govern. After the government's worst week since the election, if he was smart, fixing the Senate is something that the Prime Minister would start thinking about.